Okay, before anything else, I gotta be honest, it's like 1,000 horsepower at the crank. We've crossed the 800 wheel horsepower mark, and there is a ton of power left on the table once we put better fuel in this motor. It is eager to make more. But with that said, we can now cross the biggest hurdle off the list towards getting this car out on the track for the very first time. There is now a tune on it, and it is safe to beat on, but getting to this point has been anything but easy. It has been kicking my ass for the last 2 weeks, so let me catch you up to speed, and let's go over to Animal Auto, and I'll let you guys hear this thing absolutely scream.
Now, most of you probably don't need a recap, so feel free to skip ahead, but for those of you that haven't seen every episode so far, our dyno sessions have been fraught with all of the issues that come up when you're attempting to build a custom car from the ground up. Our first dyno session revealed the need to completely redesign our engine cooling system thanks to a lot of air pockets trapped in the front of the car. We also had to revise our oil scavenging system from the turbo because it was overflowing and dumping oil everywhere. And then the big hurdle was that we broke a clutch disc. We added an additional O2 sensor to our exhaust for tuning purposes, but once we made it back over to Animal Auto for our second dyno session, we blew our intercooler end tank sky high. I fixed it on the workbench by welding it back together, but we blew it up even worse after a second pull. We did an FEA analysis to figure out why it failed, and ultimately it revealed that we used material that was just too thin. At 90 thousandths thick, it wasn't up to the task of holding up to our required boost pressures. So in the last episode, I rebuilt our intercooler end tanks using 3/16 material, and this was the outcome. Admittedly, I'm really happy with it because I started this project not knowing how to TIG weld, but here we are with a really nice, clean result. However, if you thought that's where the hurdles were going to end, well, you aren't familiar with the StanceWorks channel and how real in-depth builds go, so let's dive in and see where we are today. Now, in a perfect world, we could just trust the data the computer gave us that says our new intercooler end tanks won't fail like the original ones did. After all, we're making them out of material that's more than twice as thick. The math tells us we should be able to exceed pressures beyond 70 psi inside of our end tanks without a detrimental failure. However, I don't want to waste my time, nor do I want to waste Andrew's at the dyno again only to suffer a failure. So I want to pressure test our new intercooler, and I've got an idea of how to do it effectively. It begins by cutting up the old one. We need the aluminum HD clamp ferrules off of it. The concept is to produce a pair of plugs, something we can block off the inlet and the outlet of the intercooler with so that we can adequately pressurize it. If we cap off the ferrules we cut off of the old intercooler with some solid material, they become plugs, and if we put them back into the original HD clamps, the entire thing will be effectively sealed up to around 800 psi, or about a dozen times higher than what we need. So after cutting out and shaping a round plug and then welding it to the ferrule, we're left with this. I wouldn't say that it's beautiful, but it doesn't need to be. It fits right back into the clamp, and once locked down, it should be good to hold pressure inside. Now, because the intercooler has one in and one outlet, we do need two plugs. So I made two, but I messed the second one up, so I went across the street and had Brett machine me a new one that's threaded in the middle. This will be how we actually pressurize the end tanks. Of course, we could have just put a Schrader valve on this, but once we plummet to the shop air compressor, 150 psi is likely to make this thing explode. So as an alternative, we're going to use my leakdown tester, the same one that we used to find out that the head gasket was blown on our Audi Quattro. The concept here is that we can easily regulate the air pressure we're pumping into the intercooler. We can easily bleed it off and see what's going on inside. Now, given that our original intercooler popped at around 14 psi, and we need this one to hold substantially more, I decided to put it outside the shop for the first pressurization, just in case I've made, well, a bomb. I started with about 10 psi, and it did push the caps outwards, indicating we had positive pressure inside, but it was almost immediately that I realized there was a problem. I could hear air escaping from the water inlet and outlet. In an ideal world, we'd have had no air leakage at all, and if I had my choice, if there was a leak, it'd be through pinholes from the air tanks to the atmosphere, but air leaking into the water side of the tank is worst case scenario. In order to showcase what's happening, we filled the water side of the intercooler with water and then pressurized it with shop air. This pushed water into the air side of the intercooler, which means under boost, we'd be filling our cooling system with air, and under vacuum, we'd be filling the engine with water. Neither are acceptable. So there is a hole between this part and where it seals to the core, which is then allowing water from this tank to go past that and into this tank. Sorry, that's not very clear, but in short, I can't just get this hot and reflow it or anything because it's not this weld, it's the one underneath it. And I think my only option at this point, if I want to make my dyno appointment and not push this out until I have billet end tanks or remake the whole thing again, which I'm not interested in doing, is to, I guess, probably start by cutting this whole outside panel off and seeing if that gives me enough access to weld what's inside of there. And if it doesn't, then I'll have to start removing more of the end tank and try to close that up and then put it all back together and then hope that it works. I'm very not stoked. And so as much as it hurt my heart to do, I did just that. I cut apart the intercooler I had just finished in hopes of fixing it. With just one side panel removed, I did my best to try and weld it in situ. I had Khalil hold a mirror for me, and I tried welding upside down and backwards, but there just wasn't enough room to pull it off. So I cut the rest of the end tank off to get a better view of what's actually going on, and if we take a look down in here, between my two Sharpie marks on the rows of the core, you can see exactly where our hole is. Now, to be clear, this is my fault. It's not a bad core, but I'm under the impression that I overheated the brazing that holds these parts together, it contaminated my weld, and introduced a pinhole. I tried extensively to weld the pinhole up, only to find that the problem was getting worse, and after asking Brett for some help, he agreed there was only one solution to the problem. That was to save what end tanks we could and to cut the rest of it apart because it was back to the drawing board once again. Now, we've had bigger setbacks, but I'll say this was one of the most defeating moments of the project so far. Cutting apart a part I was really happy with and felt so confident about, all because of a stupid, tiny issue. But keeping in mind that we learned the most from our failures, I did my best to keep my chin up, cut the end tanks off, got out a fresh core, and said the third time is usually a charm. Now, thankfully, we do get to reuse the air end tanks. They're still good, but they required a lot of cleanup and fitting in order to make them work a second time around. I did my best to try to understand how I might have messed this up on the previous approach. I spent some extra time beveling the edges of the material for better penetration characteristics with less overall heat, in hopes of keeping the brazing that holds the intercooler core together from contaminating the weld once again. Having learned a valuable lesson, I realized that it's at this point, with only the air tanks welded into place, that we should pressure test this thing. We still have access to all of the welds in case we need to fix any pinholes, and as it turns out, this was a good idea, because there were still a couple of pinholes that needed some attention. But after a little bit more welding, and with a little bit of help from Brett across the street, we got this thing set up and pressurized it once more.
So 55?
Maybe where you just dunk it in a barrel of water.
That's 60 psi, so that should be more than 1,000 horsepower. Right?
This time around, this thing is holding a solid 58 to 60 psi. We used some soapy water to make sure there were no pinholes remaining, and once we were confident this thing was sealed tight, I shaped up some new water end tanks and got the whole thing welded up. With this finished up, we are finally ready to head over to the dyno. The last several times we've been to Animal Auto, it's ended in, well, not necessarily disaster, but with low spirits to say the least. It has been anything but smooth sailing. This time around, though, the car seems like it's in a better place than ever, and thus, we're feeling more confident than we have at any point prior. On top of having Andrew Molina here to tune the car, he brought in Kevin Valdez to lend a hand, one of the K-Series experts here in Southern California. Together, they'll do some smooth talking to the Haltech Nexus R5 and get this Honda-swapped Ferrari running better than ever before. After giving the car a once-over, the first thing to address was how to get the car to run effectively on the dyno. Some of you may remember the problems we were facing during our first 2 sessions. The low rotating inertia of the Honda engine was causing the car to buck on the dyno, but by breaking up the sweep, we finally got our first successful pull. $8,500 RPM has never sounded so good. With a successful pull under our belt and with the car cooperating, it was time to open the floodgates and start the process of actually tuning the car. After a bit of tinkering and a couple of test pulls, here was our first successful power number. Running 12 psi of boost, we saw 575 horsepower at the rear wheels. It's an impressive place to start, but as said, it's only the start. Slowly but surely, the power figures were adding up. On the boost side of the equation, our numbers were staying perfectly level, no boost creep whatsoever. So we kept going. The car climbed into the mid-6s and then into the 700s, and everything was looking relatively solid, although we were coming to a point where we were running out of octane in our fuel. Running 110 has its perks at the track, but some drawbacks when you're asking a 2.4 liter to make 1,000 horsepower. As a final stopping point for the day, we raised the red line up to 9,500 and then gave it one final pull. And here it is. Believe it or not, the guys at 4-piston tell us we could rev this engine all the way to 11 if we want to. I don't think we have that kind of need, though. But with all that said, the power graph is quite impressive given the size of the turbo. Our figures for the day are quite respectable. We have a 14 psi tune that puts down 638 horsepower, and an 18 psi tune that gives us 736 horsepower, both reliable enough to go beat on. Now, if you're looking for peak numbers, we did reach a staggering 810 horsepower at the wheels with just shy of 25 psi. There's no question it'll go above and beyond the 1,000 horsepower mark once we get more octane into the fuel. Realistically, I need a swap to E85 or C16. But regardless, the car really left us impressed.
So like the saying goes, third time's a charm. It's our third visit here. After some teething issues and some planning out, we finally got a successful dyno day. We were able to actually get 3 different boost levels here. These is actually just depicting 2. We have a 14 psi and then a 18 psi run, and that's kind of where we left it at. We'd love to make some more power, but pretty ecstatic with how this thing performed. My friend Kevin from KV Tuning came by and helped us figure out how to actually make a sweep on a setup that's this gnarly, and we started our sweep at like 4,800 RPM versus 2,500 RPM, and took it all the way up to, at one point, 9,500, just to see how things are going, and we ended up bringing it back down to 8,800 for today, and leaving it at 18 PSI with this being our result. So hopefully for the next session, we'll have some suspension under our belt, work out all like the gizmos and gadgets with the R5, like traction control, individual wheel speed sensors, maybe do some brake biasing, just actually working on the whole chassis itself. But for the engine setup and the management goes, it worked flawlessly. Yeah, I couldn't complain. This 4-piston engine is phenomenal, to say the least.
And we are back. It's the end of a long day at the dyno. I figured I should record something now while I'm feeling that high of a successful dyno day. It's our first one, and honestly, I'm stoked. The engine is making a ton of power. It seems really healthy, really happy. It's awesome hearing it scream all the way up to 9,500. And honestly, the guys at 4-piston have said we can take the engine beyond that if we want to. We're just talking about a shorter fuse, and I want this engine to last a long time. Knowing that where we're at, the engine is totally happy, feels really good. We can make more power, but we need to throw a better fuel at it. Realistically, I need to go to C16 or I need to make the switch over to E85, which the fuel system's happy with other than our fuel pump. I would need to upgrade the pump so that we'd have the proper capacity because E85 requires so much more fuel. So we'll see. That 1,000 horsepower mark is still something that I want to hit. We're knocking on the door of it. It's right there. The engine would be happy to hit it. We're just going to make some changes. Maybe I'll go out and buy some C16, fill up the tank, and we'll hit that number. Now, what I know everybody actually wants to know is, when is this car going to go out on track? It's what we've been working towards now for 2 years, and clearly we are really close. Well, there's a couple of things that I want to get done before we go out there. The first one is I want to focus on safety. We need to get a roll bar installed, and we need to get seat belts installed, and I've got a full fire suppression system that needs to go into the car so that we don't lose it if the worst happens. And then we also need to work on a bit of suspension and dynamics. Basically, we've got to swap our springs out because they're a little bit too soft, and we need to get the whole car aligned. Right now, it's really just thrown together. It wouldn't track straight. We're going to wear through tires improperly. I'm going to lean on my buddy Joey Seeley and see if he'll help us out with a Seeley setup. Fingers crossed he'll have some time for us. Maybe by mentioning him now, he'll feel a little bit obligated. I don't know. But with those out of the way, we really are looking at track time. Those first slow laps, the shakedown sessions, figuring out what the car is going to need, what's going to break, and seeing what we can get done at the track before we actually need to turn around, come home, come back to the shop, and tear everything apart again. The engine seems happy. Andrew did an awesome job. Thank you to Andrew once again, as always, for taking care of me. Thank you to Kevin for coming out and lending a hand. These guys were awesome. This was an awesome day. This feels like an awesome milestone to me, something we've been working towards for so long. I can feel the finish line. It's within my grasp now. We're going to get out on track. We're going to have some fun. But before we get anything else done, I've got an E36 episode coming for you guys on Tuesday. I got my interior. I've got a new cooling system going in. I've got a carbon intake plenum. Lots of cool changes. I'm excited about it. That car means a lot to me. And I've got apparel in hand now. I'll have that hopefully out next week or the week after. With all that said, I'm done. I got to get this episode edited. Thank you guys for the support, and I'll see you guys next week.